Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Good afternoon from Geneva to all of you, wherever you may be. I hope this finds you all well, and welcome to this online seminar co-organized by UNIDE and Japan, titled Towards Space Sustainability, Surveying Space Security Governance and Implementation Efforts. My name is Almudena Azcarate Ortega, and I am a researcher at UNIDE's Space Security Program. I will be moderating today's seminar. And before we start with the seminar, I have a couple of practical details to relay. At the outset, I should note that this event is being recorded and it will be made available on the UNIDE's YouTube channel in coming days. The format of today's webinar is a moderated discussion, which will begin with some opening questions so that we get some initial views from our experts. Before moving on to a moderated discussion, there will also be time for a Q&A with the audience. So please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to use the Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to submit your written questions. Other participants will not be able to see your questions, but the panelists will. And we will try to get to as many questions as possible. We will treat the questions as anonymous. So if you do want to be identified and you don't want your question to be anonymous, please let us know, type your name in the text of the question. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but we do have limited time, so we cannot make any promises on that account. We do welcome comments, but we encourage participants to articulate their questions in a clear manner. So now having said all of those initial housekeeping details, let me start by presenting what the topic of today's webinar is going to be about. As you may know, in recent years, space-related activities have increased dramatically, and this has been spurred by growing commercial interest in the space sector. The commercial drivers of private sector space activities will continue in the future, creating an ever more crowded space environment. In parallel, if left unchecked, military interest in outer space is likely to grow as space and counterspace capabilities develop in several states around the world. The increase in space assets, including counterspace technologies, threatens to undermine safety and security of outer space and create an unstable and also an unsustainable space environment for future generations. Dealing with all of these challenges requires leadership from states operating at the international level to build mechanisms to govern space. However, space security can no longer be achieved only by states. It will require a division of labor with international, national, and local stakeholders working together. And to address this challenge during this webinar, we will be speaking to a panel of experts in order to unpack the concepts of space security, safety, and sustainability, as well as responsible behaviors in space, and seek to identify good practices in areas of space security with a view to working towards a more stable and sustainable space environment, including through activities at the domestic level. To open this event, we are lucky to have with us Helmut Lagos. He is the chair of the currently ongoing open-ended working group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, which will be having its final session next month. Helmut, thank you so much for being here with us today. Please, the floor is yours. We welcome your remarks.
Thank you, Almudena. Good morning, good afternoon to all. I first would like to thank UNIDE and the government of Japan for this opportunity to participate and provide some personal remarks in this very timely and relevant webinar. The Secure World Foundation has defined space sustainability as ensuring that all humanity can continue to use outer space for peaceful purposes and socio-economic benefit now and in the long term. Sometimes it is difficult to convince everyone of the urgent priority of securing space sustainability, considering that there are so many other priorities. But we will have to persevere, since we risk a disruption of basic services, national security objectives, navigation, telecommunications, agriculture, scientific exploration, environmental protection, and economic development in general. Now, from a historical perspective, on October 4th, 1957, Sputnik was launched into outer space, inaugurating the era of space exploration. And just a decade after that historic milestone, on October 10th, 1967, the Outer Space Treaty entered into force. The beginning of the space age was determined by the competition between the two superpowers of the Cold War. In fact, one of the big paradoxes of the 20th century is the fact that the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union in their quest for global dominance not only increased the risks of a new and more destructive world war, but also led to the rapid development of different types of new technologies, including rocket technology, which facilitated the exploration of space, but at the same time detonated a technological revolution that has been fundamental for every single aspect of human life. We can therefore safely say that without the Cold War and the resulting space race, we would not be enjoying many of the technological inventions that are now taken for granted and that are an integral part of everyday life. It is worthwhile considering how space has changed from the beginning of the space age and from the time the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated. And in that regard, one of the most obvious differences now is the vast network of more than 1,800 satellites that surround the Earth. These satellites, as we all know, provide data for weather reporting, navigation, positioning, broadband television, much, much more. Apart from this, there are several spacecraft which pursue scientific and military objectives. Another important development is the presence of human missions from many different states in the International Space Station. But today I will not continue to describe the impressive list of technologies that we use every day, because I could continue all day. But I would like to emphasize the contribution to wider development goals in health, environmental protection, agriculture, many, many other areas of human activities. But it is now evident that sustainability in outer space faces major challenges. Among them, spacecraft collisions with orbital debris, space weather, overcrowding in low Earth orbits makes spacecraft susceptible to higher rates of failure. But certainly, these are not the only risks. There are also several security threats to space systems. These discussions about threats to space security are certainly not new, and many proposals have been made over the years to mitigate these threats. They are often subjective, and different stakeholders have different interests and therefore may hold different views regarding what really constitutes a threat. It should also be noted that the perception of threats to the security of space activities and systems can change and evolve as space systems themselves are evolving with technological change. But I will just mention the main threat perceptions without elaborating much on them. The weaponization of space has been one of the oldest concerns of states, particularly the possibility of placement of weapons in outer space. The proposal of a treaty for the prohibition of the placement of weapons has received wide support, but at the same time has been questioned by some delegations that have important conceptual issues, including the definition of a space weapon. Another threat perception, which concerns many delegations, is counterspace technologies or anti-satellite technologies, which can be direct ascent ASATs, core orbital ASATs, ground station attacks, etc. Another type of threats are non-kinetic, electronic, and cyber attacks. I should also mention intentional creation of debris. In recent years, states have expressed concern over the threat posed by the deliberate creation of debris, which is considered by the majority of states to be a significant and I would say growing and indiscriminate threat to all space objects. Harmful interference. the development, the use of non-kinetic technologies that could intentionally interfere with the regular operations of a satellite system through electronic, cyber, or other non-kinetic means. Dual use and dual purpose space objects. This is one of the favorites of Almudena. Many states have highlighted the dual nature of many space objects as an issue of concern that can make the protection of space assets from threats a challenge. Over the past years, several international initiatives have been established to address some of the challenges posed by to space sustainability. Among others, the group of governmental experts on transparency and confidence building measures, and also the group on the prevention of arms race in outer space deserve to be mentioned. And despite of the usual initial skepticism of some observers, this group of governmental experts that I mentioned on transparency and confidence building measures, TCBMs, actually managed to reach a consensus report of recommendations in 2013, which is still valid today, but unfortunately has not been fully implemented. The only conclusion of that report was that voluntary norms or political commitments can serve as the basis for the negotiation of legally binding instruments in the future. In my opinion, this conclusion also applies to other processes and is particularly relevant, taking into consideration the concern expressed by a few delegations regarding the risk of discarding completely the possibility of negotiating legally binding instruments in favor of these other voluntary norms. Another successful process was the long-term sustainability working group at COPUOS, which was tasked with producing a set of voluntary guidelines for all space actors to help ensure the long-term sustainable use of outer space. A new approach, which is based on the responsible behavior of states, seeks to agree on norms, rules, and principles of that responsible behavior in order to achieve greater trust between the actors and strengthen space security, was established with Resolution 76231 of 2021, when the General Assembly decided to establish this open-ended working group, which I am honored to chair, which has a mandate to formulate recommendations on possible norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior in relation to state threats to space systems. And also, part of the mandate is to submit a report to the General Assembly. So far, I must say that the discussions have been constructive, and I would also like to add much more positive than initially expected. We have had 3 sessions so far and are now preparing for the final meeting in Geneva to draft our final report. I do remain cautiously optimistic that we will be able to reach consensus, but I will still rely on the inclusive and proactive engagement of all delegations. Now, I would just give a few takeaways about these processes in general from my perspective. In the discussions of the different multilateral initiatives, we have not only been able to confirm the different threat perceptions, as I mentioned, but also a diversity of views regarding the legal dimension of outer space activities. While in general there is a recognition on the validity of the Outer Space Treaty, it has been interesting to observe that some consider that the existing regime is enough to cover all aspects, while others consider that new instruments should be negotiated. It also showed that while there is a growing common understanding on the applicability of norms of international law in general in outer space, a few states consider that the norms of international humanitarian law do not fully apply in that domain. I mention this because I am convinced that the norms of IHL apply in all human activities, and also that the international community will assume this common understanding in the future. The discussion about the military use of outer space is usually underlying many of the security debates. While some delegations still appeal to avoid the militarization of outer space, the truth is that the space race has been a military effort from the beginning. And this is not in contravention of the Outer Space Treaty, as long as it is not violating the obligation on the preservation of the peaceful uses. Nowadays, the military use of space includes the use of spacecraft designed to support terrestrial military intelligence operations, such as global positioning, navigation, timing systems, communications intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, satellites. While these activities could be considered as legitimate, there is also a growing concern about national doctrines that are declaring outer space as a warfighting domain. Another dimension that I would like to highlight is the importance of outer space for environmental protection, considering the key contribution to the mitigation of climate change. It is also important to emphasize the need to maintain outer space free from pollution, and in this regard, addressing the threat of space debris is an urgent priority, as well as preventing it from becoming the new garbage disposal for our planet. I cannot conclude without mentioning the report For All Humanity, the Future of Outer Space Governance, released just recently by the United Nations, and which contains a series of recommendations on the opportunities and risk of space exploitation ahead of the 2024 Future Summit. In this document, the Secretary General has advocated the development of a governance that will allow innovation and in turn promote the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, a few final thoughts, because I wrap up. The object of securing the sustainability of outer space should be consolidated as a central priority for all states and its citizens, as it affects us all, whether we are aware or not. A possible disruption of space-based services would have a huge impact on the lives of millions, and possibly catastrophic humanitarian consequences. The most important of all tasks, in my opinion, is to preserve the peaceful uses of outer space for the benefit of all and to make a collective effort to prevent a possible armed conflict in outer space. The responsibility to prevent these risks and address these threats is shared by all states, in contrast with the context of the negotiation of the Outer Space Treaty. We now see a growing awareness of the role of all states, an emerging empowerment of delegations that are not necessarily major spacefaring nations, but that understand that all states are equally stakeholders. Also, cross-regional initiatives have also proven very helpful to give dynamism to the discussions. I must also underline the important role of non-state actors in these discussions. While states retain a central responsibility, it is a fact that most of the activities in outer space are now developed by private companies. The result has been that the technological progress has been much more impressive than the work of policymakers. I must confess this. Activities like this today are vital to strengthen the dialogue between states and industry and academia. One aspect that I consider still a pending area is to achieve a stronger engagement of civil society representatives in general in our discussion. As we have seen in the climate change multilateral process and also in the discussions on nuclear disarmament, the involvement of activists, particularly from youth organizations, has been key to mobilize governments and raise awareness about these global concerns and priorities. Finally, I would like to say that the geopolitical context is, of course, affecting all of these processes and discussions. It is a fact that we cannot ignore, but we should not be discouraged by this geopolitical context. On the contrary, it gives us really, it puts our work in the center of the priorities of our efforts and collective efforts, and therefore, through diplomacy, creativity, and the contribution of all different stakeholders, we have an even stronger obligation to make a contribution to world peace and particularly to the sustainability, safety, and security in outer space. I am sorry, Almudena, if it was a bit too long, but I will wrap up here, and I thank you again and wish all of the participants a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helmut. No, that was not too long at all. That was perfect. In fact, it provides a really wonderful foundation for the discussion that we're about to have. Thank you for providing that really thorough outline of how space has changed over the years and the work, especially that the OEWG has been doing. I think it's really useful to that you've highlighted all of the points that you have. I particularly liked how you mentioned the importance of a collaborative environment in terms of the different stakeholders that exist and that have to work together to ensure that space is kept peaceful, secure and sustainable. And in fact, it is such a, we've tried to represent such a mix of different stakeholders here in this webinar today. And I'm going to introduce the different experts that we have with us today, who will hopefully also provide remarks from their own unique perspective to further highlight the points that you, Helmut, have shared with us in your opening remarks. Thank you so much for being with us today. Now we're going to move on to the panel parts of the webinar. This will be, again, a moderated panel where experts will share their initial views, and then we will move on to a moderated discussion. Again, I do encourage everybody in the audience to please send your questions through the Q&A function that you have at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers for today, and then I'm going to give the floor to them. First, we have Aya Iwamoto. She is the Vice President of Japan's Space Policy at Astroscale Japan. She is responsible for Astroscale's policy efforts in Japan towards spaceflight safety to achieve long-term sustainability. Secondly, we have Benjamin Silverstein. He is a research analyst for the space project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And his research focuses on prospects for multilateral cooperation on issues like space situational awareness and orbital debris remediation. We also have Noel Rosa Castillo. She is the director of the Space Policy and International Cooperation Bureau of the Philippine Space Agency. And she's part of the work that the Bureau is doing to handle direction on space policy matters. She provides legal services for the agency's internal and external processes. And last but not least, we have Sarah Erickson, who is a research assistant for the Space Security and Weapons of Mass Destruction programs at UNIDIR. Her research focuses on space security and the history and future development of national space strategies, and she is leading the work on UNIDIR's space security portal, which will be launching very soon. So I think it would be good to start with Sarah. Sarah, why don't you provide us an overview of what is space security, space sustainability, and space safety, and how they all relate to one another from your perspective? I think it would be also really useful if you could provide a foundation in terms of what these definitions, what these words mean. Thank you very much, Sarah. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Almu, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So as Almu had mentioned, that since the dawn of the space race, really new space technology development and activity has given rise to concerns over space security, space safety, and the peaceful uses of outer space, and eventually space sustainability. So I do think it's useful for the purposes of our discussion to establish kind of a common understanding of these concepts and how they are largely used and navigated by the international community, and especially within the context of the United Nations. So we have space security, which is commonly understood to refer to measures designed to prevent deliberate harms to a space system from intended or intentional threats undertaken by another actor. Space security is also concerned with the relationship between space objects and the maintenance of international peace and security. So at the level of the UN, space security discussions happen largely under the umbrella concept of PAROS, or Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space, and they fall under the purview of bodies such as the Conference on Disarmament, the General Assembly's First Committee, the UN Disarmament Commission, or in ad ad hoc processes like the current OEWG on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. So we also have space safety, and this is commonly understood to refer to measures aimed at preventing accidental or unintentional hazards to space systems. And the issues of space safety, they're generally understood to be part of the broader topic of the peaceful uses of outer space, which is discussed at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS, and under the purview of the UN General Assembly's 4th Committee. I do think that it's really important to note that although space safety and security are distinct topics from one another, there does exist linguistic challenges in several languages where there's not a separate word for safety and security. So it can generate confusion in distinguishing the two topics. And then we have space sustainability. So this is commonly understood to mean a stakeholder's ability to continue to be able to use space and benefit from it. So now, from understanding what space sustainability is, I think it's apparent how space safety and security are two sides of the same coin that is space sustainability. And although there is merit to the practice of distinguishing the concepts from one another at the international level, especially when we consider the challenge of negotiating new mechanisms, having too much of a siloed understanding is not always conducive towards space sustainability goals, nor is it how space governance mechanisms have always been created in the past. So examples such as the Outer Space Treaty itself are applicable to both space security, like we can take Article 4, for example, or for space safety, we can take, Article 5, for example. But it's also important to realize that in practice, there are issues, such as space debris, that have a prominent effect on both space safety and security and sustainability overall. So trying to distinguish certain issues into one camp isn't even always feasible. And so I mentioned mechanisms like the Outer Space Treaty, which have a more holistic approach in advancing all three of our favorite S words today, space safety, security, and sustainability. But what's interesting is that more frequently at the state level, an interconnected approach is also being pursued. So as part of our work at UNIDIR, like Alma mentioned, we are developing a space security portal and working to map the global space governance landscape. And in this work, I have encountered more frequently how states are using their resources at their disposal to establish overlapping measures that address space sustainability at large as a core concern. So I don't want to take up too much of the time going now, but I hope to be able to get more into the implementation and examples of aspects later in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think it was very important to have those definitions clarified from the get-go. I think this really sets up everything really nicely for the rest of the discussion. And I really like the analogy that you used of how space sustainability is a coin that has two sides, safety and security being those two sides. I think that's very easy to visualize, because I feel that when it comes to the work that COPUOS is doing on the space safety side of things are going pretty well. We have the space debris mitigation guidelines, we have the long-term sustainability guidelines. They have been doing excellent work and making a lot of headway in that sense, a lot of progress. But when it comes to the space security side of things, we often don't use the expression space sustainability as much, although I think that's changing recently, and I think the involvement of the commercial industry has a lot to do with this. So I think that's really useful to see and to understand. So thank you for that. So since I just mentioned the commercial actors and the important role that they play, which is also something that Helmut mentioned in his opening remarks, I would love to hear from Aya now, so that you can share with us your perspectives on these issues as a representative from a commercial actor. The floor is yours, Aya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Almudena, for kind introduction, and thank you, Helmut, the chair of OEWG, for the opening remark, and thank you, UNIDIR and Japanese government for hosting this event and inviting me, or Astroscale, to this important discussion. So my name is Aya Iwamoto from Astroscale Japan. I do policy work in Japan. And some people ask why commercial companies are doing policy, but we think it's very important. And a little bit introduction of us to scale. So we are a global company headquartered in Japan. We have office in US, UK, Japan, and recently announced opening an office in France. And we are dedicated to on-orbit servicing across all orbit. And we are committed to safety, space, and sustainable operation. And we emphasize development technology, business case, and also policy for sustainability, together with the focus of collaboration across the space community. So for today's discussion, I've been thinking what is the useful perspectives that I can provide. And maybe I can provide two perspectives. One is the changing role of the industry in the space governance, and also the uniqueness of the linkage of space sustainability and security. Maybe Sarah touched upon it before. So the first of all, as you know, that I think Helmut has laid out the background information of the changing landscape of the space activities. We are witnessing significant structural change in space activities, and most significant change is the launch traffic in LEO, principally from 2010, due to the development of large constellation and shift towards commercial operators. And about half of the investment comes from the private sectors, and more than half of the space object in LEO belong to commercial private sector. So considering this huge presence of the private sector in the use of orbit, commercial sector, private sectors also have responsibility to keeping space safe and sustainable. That is, we need to get involved in the discussion of space governance issues. And it is actually our incentive. There is a strong incentive for commercial operators to operate responsibly in space. Now, to some of the statistics from this, say, ComSpoc, there are like 15,000 daily conjunction within 10 kilometers for all active LEO satellites. And these conjunction creates, these makes commercial operators to decide whether to take collision avoidance maneuvers, which is an economic cost for commercial operators. So it is a strong incentive for among the commercial operators to keep our space environment safe and sustainable. That is where the revenue is actually generated in that sense. And based on the recognition that the role of commercial sector, I would like to highlight some of the roles that the industry can play. And these are not exhaustive one, but I think may be relevant to this discussion. One is commercial industry can shape industry's best practices, and that can be a basis for future norms and rules for space operation for all actors. And of course, we can implement them by ourselves, even voluntary, and inform the state actors. This is what we are doing as a private sector. So these best practices can include maybe safety, sustainability, transparency standards, and also communication, the way to communicate each other, and also information sharing. And of course, I'm not saying that private sectors are ready to open up everything. There is a proprietary issues, economic issue, but I think private sectors are making efforts and try to be transparent and sharing information as much as possible. And I think there's many that things that learn from these practices. And the other aspect the private sectors may play is that to encourage international collaboration or cooperation, because basically many of the commercial operators' activities are global in the nature, and that's what we do. And even the discussion of developing best practices, we are engaging different companies and globally. So I think that's one of the roles that private sectors can play to connect different sectors. So moving on to the second aspect that Sarah has been touched a little bit. Sarah has touched on the sort of the synergy or link of the space sustainability and space security. And this is where the uniqueness of outer space, and it creates opportunity, both challenges, in my opinion. And civil, commercial, and security actors, all of the actors share the same interests of keeping safe and stable orbit for their operations. And many of the challenges and risks, such as the risks against that, such as the congestions or space debris, are shared with all of the actors. And this suggests that there is a possibly common approach to walk all of these issues. And of course, there are some of the incongruities specific to each, activities may be specific to securities, but I think most of the things are shared and covered. So building a shared practice and norms for safety and sustainable operation is very important to important for space security discussion, as well as building blocks to overcome these challenges. And again, the industries can play a role. Private sector can contribute to discussing how to make these norms effective, what is the best practices, and informing best practices to state actors. So yeah, that's all from me. I'm looking forward. Sorry for taking a little bit of time, but thank you so much. And with that, I finished my part.
Thank you so much, Aya. No apologies necessary. I thought that was really comprehensive and really useful. And I agree that the role of the private sector is so important. And I'm so happy to see that in recent times there's been so much collaboration, and the collaboration has been so much closer between states and the private sector to form policy, both in the international context, like as we see in the OEWG, which is open to non-governmental entities, as well as in the domestic side of things. I believe that Astroscale, for example, has had a part in the development of certain Japanese space policy. So I think that collaboration is really interesting, and because the private industry has such a vast know-how, since they operate in space every day, they can provide a really useful perspective. And I also really liked the point that you raised about transparency and about how keen the private sector is about being transparent. The transparency issue, the confidence building issue, is something that we have been discussing in the multilateral context for years. This has been an issue we discussed in the group of governmental experts in 2013. This is something that we're discussing right now at the OEWG. And it is a priority for states, but it's also really remarkable to see that these things that states are raising sort of for the first or the second time, that they seem like novel ideas, the private industry has been doing for a long time. These suggestions, such as increasing the information that we provide when we register space objects, for example, or to notify when there's going to be a change in orbit, or any sort of maneuver in orbit. These are things that the private sector and companies like Astroscale have been doing and have been saying that we should do for a long time. So I think in that sense, states, as we develop new policies and we seek to even set the groundwork for the development of new laws, we have a lot to learn from the work being done by the private sector. So thank you so much for sharing that perspective with us. I think we can move on to getting the perspective from a state now. We have with us Noel Castillo, who, as I said, works for the Philippine Space Agency. The Philippines has been doing amazing work in the context of the OEWG. Helmut Lagos, in his introductory remarks, talked about the importance of cross-regional collaborations, and I think the Philippines has been leading by example when it comes to this. They've introduced several working papers, some of which have been in collaboration with partners from other regions. And so I'm very excited by the work that the Philippines has been doing, and I'm very excited to have Noel here to talk a little bit about her perspective on all of these issues. Noel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, UNIDIR and the government of Japan, for inviting me to share the discussion table with the other distinguished panelists here. And thank you very much. This is a chance to share my thoughts and experience in this timely topic regarding space safety, security, and sustainability. Definitely timely. Before I start, I'd like to introduce my agency, I'm from the Philippine Space Agency, or PhilSA. We're the lead agency in the country regarding all space matters, and we were established in 2019. So we are considered to be at the beginning stages of our space program and developing all our legal policy frameworks to support our space activities. We did not start from scratch because there were already space programs introduced by our Science and Technology Department even before PhilSA was established, but we are definitely building on them, and hopefully we're propelling them to new heights. And with that being said, I would like to jump off from the introduction of our OEW Chair Helmut. In the past 50 years or so, he mentioned about how the space dynamics have changed over the years. Indeed, there has been a notable change in dynamics in international space cooperation compared to the pioneer years, where there were only 3 first signatories to the Outer Space Treaty. And looking at it now, a quick look at the UNOSA page will reveal there are 102 member agencies or states or non-state actors in observers in the COPUS. More countries are now space actors, and there is an awareness and clamor from new actors that the benefits of outer space must be harnessed, taking into account the interests of all states. As an emerging space-capable nation, the Philippines brings to the discussion table this fresh new perspective, or not fresh, but probably a different perspective. Security and, as mentioned earlier by Sarah, security and safety and sustainability of space infrastructure are separate but intertwined principles, and we are concerned with all 3 of them. We are concerned about keeping our space infrastructure secure and safe, both from physical threats and those that may be classified as cyber threats. And because we consider space technology as a tool for economic progress, we are also concerned with sustainability, or ensuring that the space programs we undertake now will not compromise the future, as mentioned earlier by Helmut in his opening remarks, in terms of socio-economic progress. We view the protection of our space infrastructure and the development of our space programs to be positively correlated to our economic growth. Thus, incidents such as collisions of space objects, cyber attacks, space debris that fall on Philippine territory, lack of transparency by other space actors, and other similar incidents that put the Philippines into a receiving end are threats to our national security and sustainability. We are guided by the discussions in COPUS, which relate to efforts towards maintaining peaceful uses of outer space, harnessing the benefits of space exploration for all nations, while at the same time ensuring their long-term sustainability. We're also guided by the UNOSA long-term sustainability guidelines, which cut across all space activities in the broad categories of policy and regulatory framework for space activities, safety of space operations, international cooperation, capacity building and awareness, scientific and technical research and development. We also support discussions in the OEWG, which also relates to sustainability as the natural result of responsible behaviors in outer space. Our challenge in the Philippines is to grow and develop our space programs, pursue further technological advancement, and at the same time, establish the necessary domestic legal frameworks that will be compliant with the sustainability and other guidelines issued by the UN, and at the same time, serve our national interests and also the interests of other states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noelle. I think that also provides a really interesting perspective of, you know, what it's like to do to work on this field of space policy making from the state perspective. Right after having heard from Aya, I think it really provides a really interesting contrast. And again, I cannot you know, give enough appreciation for the work that the Philippines is doing in leading this type of work. One of the questions that we actually at UNIDIR get asked the most by many state representatives is, especially states that are not yet spacefaring or states that have just begun to become spacefaring, is why should we become involved in these space security discussions? If we are not really active in the field, there are other states that are so much more active in the field. Why should we, you know, add to the discussion? Wouldn't that complicate matters, or what do we have to gain? And I think the Philippines really provides a good example of why everybody should be involved in this discussion, because space, you know, belongs to everyone and everybody benefits from space. And states like the Philippines can provide such a useful perspective that it's different from those initial negotiators of the OST that we heard from Helmut and from other speakers who, you know, initially it was just the US or the then Soviet Union who had a seat at the table, but now so many more states are active, and definitely every single state benefits from space services in one way or another. And I feel like those middle states, or those states that are beginning to become spacefaring nations, can really act as a nexus between different space powers that have different perspectives, and can really contribute to the creation of common understanding that is needed to ensure space security and to also ensure space sustainability. I think the Philippines is a really, really good example of that. So thank you, Noel, for sharing your perspective and for highlighting those points. We're going to move on to our last speaker, Benjamin Silverstein, who is also going to provide his perspective from a civil society point of view. So we've had industry, we've had state, we've had UN, and now we have the civil society perspective side of things, which is also really important. And I think civil society has also played a huge role in being, you know, those norm entrepreneurs, if you want to give them a name, essentially people that have an expert view of how space works, of how space policy works, what is needed, and what can be done to fulfill those needs. And I think Ben is an excellent example of this. So I'm so happy that he could be here with us today to share his perspectives. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Almu, and thank you to Unidir and to the government of Japan. I'd like to echo my colleagues' thanks for sponsoring this event. It's always lovely to participate with such expert colleagues on topics that really merit deep consideration. This is certainly one of them. So I'd like to briefly sketch out a little bit of a semicircle that links sustainability on one end to security on the other, with safety in the middle, and then trace that curve back to understand how we can support all three. And sustainability, to me, is probably the easiest entry point, or maybe the best entry point to that conversation. So to abridge the long-term sustainability guidelines, we're more consistently considering Earth's orbits as finite resources. But this concept of finite is really squishy. It's to a large extent informed by one's appetite for risk. You could imagine that a state security service that operates a satellite probably has a different appetite for risk than your local university's CubeSat demonstration club. This gradient across the spectrum of risk tolerance gives us potential highs and lows, but it doesn't really help us find that threshold beyond which an activity might be deemed too risky. What is clear, though, is that we're slowly closing the door on opportunities for operators to launch into a no or low risk environment. And put a different way, that means emerging and aspirational spacefaring communities are much more likely to have to address or accept a higher risk environment if they launch tomorrow that they may not have had to account for had they launched today or even yesterday. So when we think of exhausting that finite resource of space, we should really think about for whom it is finite. Space is more available to those who can accept higher risk. And this finiteness, if you will, is furthermore affected by how operators mitigate risks. The risks may be high, but if you're confident that you can avoid them, space gets comparatively bigger. So enlarging space in that manner is tied to your technical proficiency, which is a roundabout way of bringing us from sustainability to the second S word, safety. Space is bigger if you have the technical chops to maintain your safety. Essentially, safe space activities, rather, are enabled by two aspects: the capacity to foresee unsafe interactions and the ability to avoid them. These are two different concepts that really impact how safe you can be in orbit. This means having both a robust space situational awareness capability and maneuverable assets. And Unidir has hosted several prior conversations and has many publications about how actionable space situational awareness requires a global network of sensors. No one state can do it on its own for adequate coverage. But I'd like to highlight one other facet of the international nature of space safety, in that we're seeing more state officials around the world recognize that as I take steps to ensure that I am safe, I improve safety for you. And that happens in the reverse as well. So we've seen states take unilateral progress, but progress nonetheless, by adopting regulatory frameworks to advance space safety. And although political challenges are likely to hinder that multilateral improvement that we hope to see in the near future, the good news is that space safety is an activity that might not actually need such close political collaboration. It can be maybe accomplished in quiet concert. So getting back to that semicircle, if we think of safety as the inflection point between security and sustainability on the ends, security is related to safety just as safety is related to sustainability. The relationship is a little bit different, though. Having that better maneuverability to avoid the foreseen unsafe interactions might actually reduce security or perceptions of security. That maneuverability can also engage satellites or enable satellites to engage in activities like unauthorized rendezvous or proximity operations, things that are questionable or might raise concerns, suspicions, or breed misinterpretation that could spiral into miscalculation. This is perhaps most concerning when that misperception and miscalculation involve satellites or spacecrafts that are essential military or security assets. This nexus, I think, is really interesting because it used to be pretty exclusive to the state-to-state level, but we've seen factors of this relationship that are leaking into the state and commercial nexus and even the commercial and commercial relationships. To me, one of the most interesting things is that one of the best ways to address risks to security also improves safety. So my research focuses on space situational awareness practices around the world. And one of the biggest takeaways is that having better awareness of what's going on in space and communicating about what's going on in space really helps reduce the potential for security eroding issues. One of the other big takeaways is that there are really few global baselines for technical practices as it relates to collecting, analyzing, and using that sensed data. Essentially, there are very few organizations that collect data, which means that most of the world or most of the satellite operators around the world rely on relatively few sources for their data. And they all do their analyses slightly differently. Even the basic math that goes into some of these analyses is different. And that makes it very hard to adjudicate the truth. There is a truth, either two satellites are going to collide or they are not going to collide. But you get different interpretations of when they're going to collide, how close they're going to come if they're not going to collide, depending on who your data comes from. Strangely elusive that the truth is out there, but we can't really grasp it. One of the best ways to reduce the issues related to that is to communicate. So if we can communicate before and during maneuvers, because we think a satellite operator thinks that they might be on a collision course, the best thing to do is to maneuver away from it. To communicate about that before you do it and during the maneuver helps preempt the misinterpretation, which in turn lowers the risk to long-term sustainable and equitable access to space. And so when we think of that semicircle with safety in the middle and security and stability, or security and sustainability on both ends, I'll turn it a little bit so that it's a C for communication. Thanks again to Unidir and to the rest of the panelists. This has been a really engaging topic so far, and I can't wait for the questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. I really enjoyed you sharing your view with us, and I think focusing on specifically, SSA, data sharing, the examples that you gave about maneuvering, I think that really, moving from the theory to the practice, I think that's really helpful for us to picture how all of these discussions actually look like in real life. So I think that was really useful. And towards the end, you said something that, you were talking about the threat of miscommunication and how that can raise tensions between different actors. And that made me think that when we're talking about space security issues, threat perception is largely subjective, and you touched on this when you were mentioning that depending on what you get your information from, you're going to get one view or another view, right? So threat perception is largely based on different perceptions, but it's also based on the fear of the unknown, if you want to call it like that. And erasing that fear of the unknown is relatively easy. And Aya also touched on this during her presentation. Increased communication is key for all of this. So notifying when you're going to do something before you do it makes everybody at ease. And this has security implications, but this also has safety implications. It makes space safer for everyone, especially in a context, as you highlighted, where space is becoming increasingly more risky, and anybody that starts doing activities in space has to assume that there is an inherent risk that we didn't have in the 50s or in the 60s when states began to do activities in orbit. So I think that's really important to highlight that, even though, and this goes into what Sarah was saying at the beginning, even though we have security and safety as like two separate areas of discussion within UN multilateral debates, sure, this might make sense from an organizational perspective, but we also have to acknowledge that there is a lot of overlap between the two, and that what you do for one will impact the other. Because eventually this all feeds into this concept of sustainability. And I want to go back to that image of the coin that Sarah presented at the very beginning, of how sustainability really is this coin that has two sides. And so both of them have to be considered, and both of them are necessary when you're trying to achieve sustainability. So we really do need both security and safety for space sustainability. We're going to move on to a set of questions. I have several questions of my own. This discussion has been so interesting. So I'm excited to ask questions. I have seen that there are several people in the chat that have started to ask questions as well. I'm going to use my absolute powers as moderator to ask my question first, but then I will open the floor to the questions from the audience. So since we just talked about this separation between safety and security, which is useful, but at some points it can seem sort of artificial, I would love to get your views on how you have found these distinctions between safety and security. How do you find these are handled in your different areas of work, or from your different perspectives as very diverse stakeholders? So I think it would be interesting to start with Noel. Since the Philippines is an emerging spacefaring actor, do you have this division of safety and security in your own space policies? Do you find it useful when you go to multilateral debates at the UN to have these separate boxes, so to say? And how do you handle them? How do you link what you do domestically to what you're doing in the international arena?
Well, thank you. Let me answer that question. It is interesting that in our experience, we tend to lump them together, security and safety. Security and safety, they go together. If you're secure, then you're safe. If you're safe, then you're secure. Our paramount interest is really to keep, to ensure that our ability to utilize our space assets is not hampered by any threat. So that is security. The goal is very much tied up with our national interest in national security and economic growth. And because we are just, our space programs are just at the primary stages, particularly our physical assets development, we are at this very flexible stage where we can incorporate these principles and guidelines as we grow and develop our program. So I think it's a good place for us. It's a good type of governance that we are starting injecting these principles from the very start? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Noel. I think it would be really helpful to also hear, Aya, what is your perspective on this? And before you answer, I want to add, I want to complicate your question a little bit more, and I apologize for that. But I think this links to something that somebody in the chat has asked that could be really useful for you to answer. When you, because Astroscale and any other private actor, you are a private actor, and therefore you also have, as part of your business model, you obviously, private enterprises seek profit. And when you are involved in policy, you have to also balance this perspective of you are a business, obviously you are there to obtain a profit from that business, but you're also doing something when you collaborate with the government for the purposes of policy making, where you're seeking to help out and provide your expertise in so that it's helpful for a policy that eventually has to be applied equally, in this case to everybody that's subject to that domestic policy. And the same applies when a company is part of international conversations like the OEWG. How do companies balance that, goal of seeking a profit from that, and that goal of, seeking to help the processes with their expertise? So you have essentially two questions to answer. How does a company balance the safety and security aspect? And how does a company balance the goal to obtain profits with the goal to provide their know-how for a sort of altruistic end, which is helping policymaking?
Okay, so thank you for that question. So as for first question, how to balance security and sustainability, and I can only answer for perspective from on-orbit servicing companies, and as I think Ben touched upon some of the concern of maneuver capabilities, and I have pointed out before in the similar conversation that we are aware of the concern of sort of the risk of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, miscalculation that could lead to an escalation and necessity to mitigate such a risk from state actors. But we think what makes us, harmful is not decided by technology itself, but intent and how it's going to be used. And we think with this issue of congested environment, we must both prevent and remediate the space environment. And in order to remediate space environment, removal defunct satellite objects or other in-orbit servicing technology like refueling or maybe repairing in the future, manufacturing would be definitely important. So I think in a way, might not be a direct answer, but how we try to sort of make on-orbit servicing as more like routinized, making commercial on-orbit servicing as everyday kind of operation is actually the one how to balance space sustainability and security. And we private sector, we try to provide example, Astroscale, we are engaging conversation among industry as confers and try to provide guidelines for on-orbit servicing as an industry. And also as a company, we get licensed for our missions in coming days. In this year, we are trying to launch a new satellite, Operation Address J operation that's the close approaches to one of the Japanese space debris. That is also, we are in the process of getting license from Japan and New Zealand. Both country has a sort of explicit requirement for on-orbit servicing. So I think this is how we try to balance through our daily life. And then coming back to and going to the next question, it's a tricky one. I would say, well, yeah, some people said, you're a private company, you only think about money. Yeah, maybe true. But because of that, we think about space sustainability and safety issues as very core concern because it relates to each other. And it's not easy to seek a balance, but since our operations is global in nature. Space belongs to everyone. Whatever we does affect everyone. And space debris does not distinguish who you are and whose object belongs to. So in that sense, in order to sort of preserve the investment the private sector made to the space assets, we have strong incentive to keep space environment safe and sustainability. That's the reason some of the space companies are engaging discussions, Space Safety Coalition, producing best practices, and they have recently issued the revised version of it, and WEF, World Economic Forum, recently announced new space debris kind of recommendation involving space companies. And I realized that ESA has recently announced these space zero debris charter involving space companies. And so it's not easy, but we try to sort of find a balance between these lines. So I hope this would be an answer to the question. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Aya. And I think that is very similar to something that Ben raised before about how he was referring to states making policy, if I'm not mistaken. But I think this applies to private companies as well, right? If, you know, when you are, because space is used by so many different actors, and as you said, you know, space debris does not discriminate. It's there and it can harm anybody. When you're making these recommendations on what you're contributing to policy making, is not, you're no longer just doing it for yourself. I mean, you obviously wanted to benefit you, your state, your private company that you represent, whichever organization that you're part of, but it's going to end up benefiting a lot of people as well, because I think space has that inherently international and multi-stakeholder characteristic. Everybody's there, everybody benefits from it, right? So I think that's really true, and it makes, to me at least, it makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of questions, so we're starting to get a lot of questions from the audience. Thank you so much for that. I encourage you to please continue sending your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. So we're going to move on to a new question. I would like to pose this question to anybody in the panel, but I think this time around the first person that I'm going to ask is Sarah. Since you're part of the of Unity and the team at Unity who's involved with the OEWG, and you've been part of the whole process of the OEWG, you have this view, this holistic view of what's going on at the UN when it comes to space security. You know, considering this global space governance landscape, what efforts do you feel states have been carrying out that you think have been making a positive impact? And I'm going to link this to a question that came from the audience from Dr. Abida Rafiq. He asks how transparency and confidence building measures, which is something that we've been talking a lot in the context of the OEWG, can be enhanced in the space domain. How can we strengthen transparency and information sharing to build trust among space actors?
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. So in the work of supporting OEWG, but also in work of creating this space security portal and trying to really map the global space governance landscape, we've really found a myriad of different types of mechanisms that are addressing these issues. And of course, they span a spectrum from legally binding to normative or voluntary type of approaches. And so we have, at the international level, besides just the 5 kind of key treaties of the UN and also declaration and legal principles in the form of UN General Assembly resolutions, we have also international voluntary mechanisms which try and establish a sort of expectations around welcome and stable behavior that also helps strengthen the multilateral security and peace mechanisms. So here we can take, for example, the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation, where states can subscribe to make, for example, pre-launch notifications, disclose space launch vehicle test flights, and this type of activity really helps contribute to a more predictable space environment. We can also take example of the space debris mitigation guidelines. So like guideline 4, for example, which is about avoiding intentional destruction and other harmful activities. We can see its applicability to space sustainability overall, but also specifically space security. So when states in their national capacity subscribe or support some of these international conventions and mechanisms, of course, then that aids in transparency, but that also helps strengthen the global governance mechanisms that exist. But I do want to focus more on and emphasize more on state activity and how important it is for states to take that rigorous unilateral action to contribute to the overall governance landscape. So we've seen states use a variety or a varied toolkit, if you will, of domestic mechanisms. And these include things such as establishing a national space policy or national space law. It's creating national space military doctrines, creating domestic space structures, and also declaring or adhering to political commitments. And so different states have adopted a combination of these mechanisms, some all, or just some of these mechanisms. But what has been interesting to see is that many of these mechanisms, and as Noel had referred to, are actually encompassing a more holistic approach of tackling space safety, security, and sustainability. And this is because many states actually emphasize in their national space policies that a key priority for them is to exercise and ensure their right to access space, right? And to continue to be able to benefit from space. And it's something Ben had mentioned, he had mentioned the risk appetite kind of states. And I think that the reason why being able to enshrine a state's right to access to space is because many states have different levels of risk appetite that is tied to their resources that they have available, right? So for some states, it's not so much a question either of risk appetite or what you're willing to lose. It's really how can you ensure that the amount of resources you have to be able to start becoming spacefaring or to protect that space asset. You really want to be able to protect that because it may be your only satellite or your only spacecraft for a time being. So we really see that as a core concept in a lot of states' priorities. And in general, to also answer the additional question about transparency, when we think about either these policies or political commitments, what it really does is give other states a common expectation for what that state's space activity and behavior should look like. So that way other states can understand and come to an expectation of what the state's space activity will look like. And in this regard, it also helps the multilateral processes, because if you think about it, establishing your domestic framework and establishing your domestic posture can really serve as a springboard when it comes to the multilateral processes like the OEWG, because then states have their platform or their established platform and posture from which they can have more effective, consistent contribution to processes like the OEWG. So in addition to another example, I'll mention cognizant of time, but we also see that states are really capitalizing on some of their military resources to include space as a strategic sector, which helps them be able to mobilize towards supporting their overall national space programs. And so we see that setting up some of these military organs and borrowing from the capacity of a state in that way can help implement their national space policy goals as well. Yeah, and so overall, I think that at the state level, rather than copying kind of the siloed approach that exists at the multilateral level, we see that nations are pursuing a more fluid approach and evidently recognizing the codependent relationship between security and safety. And again, I think what's most important is that either states at the domestic level, or if they take advantage of regional perspectives as well, so maybe they don't have the capacity yet to develop their own domestic policy, but they can take advantage of up and coming kind of regional forums, like we're thinking African Space Agency, or outside the Latin American and Caribbean Space Agency, or even APRSAF, the Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum. So either of a state starts communicating its priorities at the domestic level, the regional and the multilateral level, all of that really contributes to transparency, because it's great for states to make known what their priorities are and what their concerns are. So I hope that answers the question. It wasn't too much of an overload in a short amount of time.
No, thank you, Sarah. That was great. I am cognizant of time, so I'm just going to give Ben the chance to also reply to this question real quick before wrapping up with one final question for like sort of final thoughts from all panelists. But Ben, since your expertise is also SSA, I'm going to link that question of considering the global space governance landscape, what efforts do you think states are making that are having a positive impact from the perspective of SSA? And I see that somebody in the audience, Lorenzo Arona, has raised the issue of how there are certain actors who have talked about SSA data sharing a lot, and even have talked about the possibility of setting an international organization for SSA data sharing or space traffic management data sharing as an ideal long-term objective, and whether you believe that this is a viable or a desirable outcome, and if so, how it could be achieved. So as you see, not difficult at all, but if you could give us a brief answer, would be very grateful to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I'm pretty sure I could go till it's 8:20 a.m. here. I could go until 8:20 p.m. If you'd allow me, but I'll try to keep it brief. I think that the international organization to perform space traffic management is a very long-term goal. I think organizationally, there are a lot of questions to be answered about whether an existing organization like the ITU, like ICAO, or does it fall under the purview of UNOSA? Who should take it on is an enormous question, and frankly, it makes me a little bit nervous about the fruitfulness of that debate, because it's such an organizational question, that the function and the not the merits of it, but the outcomes would be a so far in the future that it would be difficult to adjudicate success here. But overall, yeah, the ability of states to engage in those conversations is at least a good step forward. To recognize that they're conversations that need to be had, they're conversations that are relevant to their safety, security, and the sustainable uses of outer space, which, as everybody here has recognized, directly benefit states' positive development and economic growth, and societal benefits around the world. So to me, one of the best ways that TCBMs can be enhanced or strengthened is by setting good baselines of behavior and holding oneself accountable to fulfilling those, which is a lot easier said than done. But to say, we have humans in space, we are going to treat those assets in very specific ways. We are expecting more people to be in orbit very soon. Here are the types of rules that we expect to follow ourselves regarding close passes between crewed space stations, between objects that have people on them, because I think that's fundamentally different and new in ways that uncrewed space systems don't really have the same teeth to them, or the same heft. So one of the things that I think a near-term but still future-looking issue would be addressing the issues that arise from having essentially more population in space, and to enhance and strengthen those transparency and transparency mechanisms, and to enhance the confidence of states that those human-laden systems are not going to be interfered with or negatively impacted by purposeful means, but also to address accidental issues or to preclude the chance that accidents happen, or that one's space activities could foment an accident aboard a crewed space station.
Thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your views with us. I am cognizant of the time, so I am going to give each panelist literally just like 30 seconds so that you can give us your, some wrap-up remarks of the discussion that we've had here today. You can frame it from the perspective of, what should we do moving forward? What takeaways from current processes we have to consider? Or essentially anything that you think attendees should take away from this webinar today. Let's start with Sarah, since you are at the top of my screen. The floor is yours.
Vic, thank you. I think in final remarks, I'll just say I think we should not underestimate the impact of unilateral action of a state, nor its ability to be able to cooperate regionally, because this all has proven to be very, very fruitful for states, and that we cannot emphasize enough states' active and consistent contribution to multilateral negotiation process, despite and no matter what their status in space may be. And finally, just about bringing civil society and industry all together as a way to strengthen the networks and make the networks of all of those regional and state talent that are experts in this, and make that more evident and accessible to the state level. And yeah, final thank you, and thank you again to Government of Japan to be able to sponsor this event, because it's been a fantastic conversation with everyone. Thanks to all my fellow panelists as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for those final remarks. I agree. Why don't we move on to Noel?
Yes, so before everything, thank you again very much. As a final word, I would just like to give appreciation also to the UN and to the platform that it continues to provide, so that the states are in a way forced so to speak, forced to confront the issues regarding responsible behaviors in outer space beyond what is being discussed in Corpus. So let's continue to do that, and we appreciate that, and I believe it has impacted very much all states that are involved, and even beyond the states, as those principles trickle to our domestic industries, and as we build our space programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Noel. And I agree that the work is not done and there is yet more to be done. Ben, how about you? Please let us know what you think.
So yeah, let me echo everybody's thanks to both UNIDIR and to the Government of Japan. And I'd also like to echo Sarah's comments about the impact of unilateral action, and to get back to that idea of quiet concert versus close political alignment and agreement. As long as unilateral action raises the current baseline and the base, the benchmarks of space safety, it's a great way, and perhaps one of the quote unquote easiest lowercase e ways to improve space safety. There are so many organizations out there, whether civil society or private sector, that are doing really important work, getting governments on board to what 5 years ago would have been advanced concepts in space safety and sustainability. And that bottom-up approach and aligned with the top-down approach can kind of create that middle band. And I think that's maybe a sweet spot for right now, given the political environment. And so I just like to encourage the good work that people are doing. It's not going unnoticed.
Thank you very much, Ben. Aya, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I would also like to add my voice for appreciation for everyone. And again, I have 2 points. One is I would also like to echo what Sarah and Ben said about the importance of the impact of unilateral actions. And and that will actually increase the entire level of the safety. And this shows that there is things, there are things that you can actually start now. Whatever you can do, it's better to start now, because the situation of the congested orbit doesn't give us or allow us to have a time and luxury of time and consider or debating forever. So I think it's a very important point that unilateral action actually gives an impact. And the second point is related to the previous discussion. Well, private entities get licensed in order to do space activity. So this is where also states can play through their regulational powers, as well as the policy power and how to regulate space operators. And also they can give incentives to space operators to behave safe and responsible. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aya. With that, we'll close our panel discussion. Thank you so very much to all of our wonderful panelists and to the audience for asking such interesting and engaging questions. I'm sorry that we didn't have the time to go through all of the questions, but we will definitely continue doing work in this area, and we will continue having events discussing these topics. So hopefully we'll see you in the future, and we'll be able to address those questions. At this time, I would like to turn the floor over to Minister Shigeru Umetsu. He is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Delegation of Japan to the Conference on Disarmament. And he has been so kind to agree to deliver some closing remarks before concluding today's event. Thank you so much, Minister Umetsu. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Ortega. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let me begin by thanking Helmut, who is the chair of the OEWG, who kindly joined this webinar meeting. And also the same appreciation goes to all the panelists, namely Aya-san from Astroscale and Ms. Castillo from the Philippine Space Agency, and Mr. Silverstein from Carnegie Endowment, and Ms. Sarah from UNIDIL for their thoughtful interventions and excellent insight presented during the webinar. I would also like to thank the moderator, Ms. Ortega from UNIDIL, for skillfully leading today's discussion. I'm also pleased to hear the lively and interactive discussion, including Q&A session. And as pointed out today, while our society is increasingly reliant on space systems, the outer space environment has been rapidly changing with the influx of new actors and the diversification of activities. As a result, risks to the stable and sustainable use of outer space are more serious today than ever before, as outer space is becoming increasingly congested and contested and competitive. Moreover, as Helmut stated, the dual-use nature or dual-purpose use of space object adds complexity to define a weapon in outer space and make it challenging to interrupt or interpret and verify intention behind certain outer space activities. For this reason, the international community is required to develop new ideas and approaches that enable us to overcome these challenges. Japan underscored the need to deepen the discussion on responsible behavior and the need to establish common understanding on patterns of responsible or irresponsible behavior that could realistically endure in the face of changing circumstances. To this end, I found today's webinar to be of great relevance, as it allows us to better understand the concept of security, safety, sustainability, and responsible behavior in space, including activities at the national level, and to identify good practices in the field of space security. I'm glad that the research paper report based on today's discussion is scheduled to be published in early August before the fourth and final session of OEWG to be held during the last week of August. I hope that this report will provide productive and useful inputs for the discussions at the OEWG. And finally, allow me to add that in the area of space security, engaging various stakeholders matters. As this is also pointed out by Aya-san, new and positive technologies which contribute to enhancing space security have been developed by the private sector, including debris removal techniques. Therefore, we hope that states will engage and support private sector more to enable them to play more active roles for space security in close collaboration with governments. Japan will spare no effort to this end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister, for those remarks. It's been a pleasure for us to be able to organize this webinar with the government of Japan, and we're very, very thankful for your support. Once more, I would like to thank all of the people that have made this event possible. First of all, our wonderful panelists for sharing your time and your expertise with us. Also, our opening speaker, Mr. Helmut Lagos, the chair of the OEWG, for providing the basis for such a fruitful discussion. And of course, Minister Uematsu for your closing remarks. Thank you also to the UNIDID team that produced this event, especially Shizuka. She's been doing a wonderful job, and this wouldn't have been possible without your help. Thank you also to the audience for joining this event and for all of the really thought-provoking and engaging questions that you've sent us. Again, I apologize for not having been able to get to all those questions, but thank you. Please know that this event has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube at a later date, in case you want to revisit the discussions that we had today. You will also receive an email from the UNIDID team asking for your feedback. Alternatively, you can scan the QR code that was just displayed on the slide in your screens, or you can also click the link that was sent through the chat. If I could encourage you all to fill in this feedback form, it's very short, it won't take more than a minute. It's also anonymous, and it really helps us to improve our event moving forward. You may be interested in knowing that this event, as Minister Uematsu actually already mentioned, this webinar is part of a wider project that we're working on at the UNIDID Space Security Program, which is focusing on exploring the relationship between space security, safety, and sustainability. And as Minister Uematsu said, we will be publishing a report on this issue, which will include takeaways from this webinar right before the fourth session of the OEWG. I encourage all of you to keep an eye out for this publication. You can do so by subscribing to UNIDID's newsletter and by following us on social media. I also want to take this opportunity to say that our flagship annual event, the Outer Space Security Conference, will be taking place on the 13th and the 14th of September. And registration is now open and accessible via the UNIDID website. We will actually continue to discuss topics similar to the ones that we've been addressing at this webinar today. So if you are interested by these discussions, we urge you to attend. You can either do so in person or virtually. And I also encourage you to explore our space security publications and resources, which you can find through the space security page on the UNIDID's website. Thank you again for being here today to all of you, and have a lovely day or night wherever you may be.